delighted that you are here. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to introduce my friend and brother, Brother Ed Harrell. I've got a whole sheet of paper here about all his accomplishments and what he's done, and who's honored him, and how many books he's written. And I'm not going to read all that. He wouldn't have time to speak if I did.
That's okay.
But I want to tell you a little bit about my personal contact with him. I was dean and Bible teacher at International Bible College in Florence, Alabama. And he came to preach at one of the non-institutional churches in that town, and I went to hear him. I didn't know who I was hearing. I was simply attending a meeting, and as I frequently did. But I was impressed by hearing him. And I remember still the sermon that he preached. It had to do with the identity of the church, and it had to do with how you find it. And it ended up by saying, this is the characteristics that I think it has. And if you don't believe all of those, like I do, I can live with that. But if you don't follow this pattern of how to find it, then I can't walk with you. That impressed me because that's about how I felt about things. And since then, we've had a number of contacts, and every time I've ever heard him, I've been blessed. And you're about to be blessed because you're going to hear him.
Well, thank you, sir. Last week, or a few weeks ago, I turned to 89. So I thought to myself, what in the world am I doing making another speech? But it was hard to give this up. So I'm glad. By the way, when I turned to be 89, it reminded me of a story that when I go to India, lots of times for years, I've been going now I was a director of American Studies there for about 25 years ago. But anyhow, the Indians would always be fascinated by how old I was, as they do all foreigners, and we do Indians. But always when they come up to me and say, how old are you? And I would always say, well, how old do you think I am? And it was always complimentary. They would say, oh, maybe 45. So I liked it. But anyhow, not too long ago, I got on an elevator, and the young man and lady were riding down with us, and the man turned to me and he said, how old are you? And I said, well, how old do you think I am? And he said, oh, about 100. So I said, okay, we're not going to play that anymore. Now, I agreed to come and do a lesson on writing religious history. I am a historian, as most of you know, and I've written 9 books, basically, that are history books that have to do with religious studies as well. And so it's hard to say, how do you go about? Is it working?
Yep.
It is now.
Okay. You want to know how old I am? I need to get in there. All right. It is so hard to say, how can I write stories about religious studies? And I tried to get an accumulation of how do you go about writing about religion. And let's see here. What I start with is to say that biblical stories are true stories. That if you want to write something about religion, the first thing you need to nail down is that what I'm going to do is tell the truth. As we all know that there's fake news every day in the newspapers, but there are clearly fake news in religious studies and in religious documents. So fake history does exist. And I'd say that the first thing that we need to prepare ourselves for is that we don't end up making mistakes, but rather that what we do is we do a historical teaching that is inspired. And so we have a commitment to try to say what I'm going to talk about religious topics, but I'm going to tell them as the truth. I taught graduate students for 30, 40 years, and the best definition that I ever got of religious truth, or the theory of telling the truth, was a book written by one of my fellow students at Vanderbilt, Faulkner, who said he wrote a book that's called The History and Theory of History. And he says what a history should be. A history is a story purportedly true about the human past. That's simple enough. If you want to write about the history, what you do is you tell the truth. And you read and study what is there, and that's about as good a definition as you can get. Good history is not perfect, but the first thing that historians have to deal with is to say, I'm going to tell this as the truth. There always is a temptation for people to change that and decide that they have new kinds of ideas that need to be influenced. Harvard historian Arthur Schlesinger Jr. Made a good statement in the New York Times about how so many people were writing definitions of history that they just made up and paid no attention whatsoever to what the past has taught us. It was known in the 1960s as postmodernism, and that is that the idea that people should use other ideas rather than just what definition that we just got tell us. All right, I'm going to forget that. That was one of my best friends who told that I was really a good guy. So we'll leave that for the moment. Oh, yeah, I need to tell you about this. This was a session at the American Academy of Religion in 1985. And I was one of the speakers. I was kind of the lead speaker. And I had just finished writing a book about Oral Roberts, which was a huge book and a huge undertaking. I'd worked on it for probably 3 years. And so I'd just gotten really good reviews of that book. And after I finished, a young woman was the next person to make a statement. So her topic was Mama Lulu Voodoo Priestess in Brooklyn. Now that just seemed a little out of place to me after what I had just gone through too. So she told the story of Mama Lola. And when she got through, we had a kind of a question and answer session. And so I asked her, I said, well, that was some interesting stuff. I said, how long did it take you to collect that information? Where did you get all that information? And she said, I didn't get it anywhere. She said, I just made it up. It was just a good story. But she actually said that. She said, I just made that up. And so my response was, I said, well, that was pretty interesting. I'd like to meet her sometime. But that's not history. That is the lowest form of non-history. So what I would say is that if you're going to write history, you don't write fiction. Now, fiction is fine. I mean, you can learn some good things, and there are lots of good stories out there, many of them with good circumstances that teach us things, but they're not history. History is something that is based upon efforts to try to see what can be told. And is that the bell?
Well, that's Wayne. This phone's going off. That story is phone going off.
And I turned it off twice already.
He's making history.
I'll polish your shoes after lecture, brother Ed.
You have to shut me up more times than that. Well, let me just say with that prelude that if I have to give one answer to how do we go about writing religious history, my answer is tell the truth.
Amen.
Do your research, get the information, and then tell the truth. If you don't like somebody, that's your right to not like them. But what you have to do is you have to tell the truth. By the way, I think I come to this after a while. My wife, I would frequently go home and tell her what I had studied that day, and she would say, well, they shouldn't have done that. And I would say, well, I know they shouldn't have done that. This is not a book about what they should have done. It's a book about what they did do. So that is what true history is. That number one, it's a simple matter. If you say, how should I go about writing religious history? You do your job, study, and then tell the truth. And you don't have to make it any harder than it is, but neither do you make it any softer than it is. I want to read this passage in Philippians, the 2nd chapter, the 3rd chapter, in verse 12 beginning. Not as though I've already attained, either are already perfect. And let's notice that, because my wife has to tell me that sometimes. Said I've already attained, neither was I already perfect, but I follow after. Can we get that? Okay, yeah. Well, it's all right. I'll probably mess it up anyhow. Brethren, I count not myself to have apprehended, but this one thing I do, forgetting all those things that are behind, and reaching forth unto things which are before, I press on toward the mark of the prize of the high calling in God. Let us therefore, as many as be perfect. Now I tell you to read that passage at some point, because what the Apostle Paul says is, what we need to try to do is to be perfectly true to the things that we write. And then he says, but I count not myself up. I'm not perfect. I know that. But then he goes back in verse 15. Let us then, as many as be perfect. Now I'll tell you what our responsibility is in life. And that is to try to be as perfect as we can be. But we will never be perfect, and you'll never write a perfect book, by the way. But what we have to do is we just have to press on. But he said, what you do is you press on. Let us therefore, as many as be perfect. And he just said we can't be perfect. But then he says, here's a message for those of us that we should be perfect. For those of us who are perfect, be ye thus minded. And if you be any otherwise manifest, God, I'm not reading this very well, by the way. But what he goes through two conclusions. He says, in the first place, we're not going to be perfect, but I'll tell you what we're going to try to do. We're going to try to be perfect. And said we all need to be perfect in our effort to go about and tell things as God has revealed them to us. Now that's the best I can do for historians. If you want to write history, what you need to do is you need to do it carefully. You need to do it painfully. And you need to do it to the best of your ability. And if someone says, well, you don't get it perfect, well, it's perfect intent. All right, now let me just quickly tell you, get back to the question. By the way, I've ended up writing 9 books about religious history. Some of the people I wrote about I liked. Some of them I didn't like very well. But I tried to treat each one of them the same and to tell the story that they write. Oh, that's Mama Lola again. Oh, want her. Now, there are so many passages in the New Testament that tell us what we need to do. 1 Peter 4:11, one of my favorite passages in all of the New Testament. If any man speak, let him speak as the oracles of God. If any man minister, let him do it as the ability which God giveth, that God may be glorified in all things, through Jesus Christ forever. Amen. Now let's see, here's my son-in-law has drawn pictures of all of my books here. As a religious historian, I have refused other interviews from all kinds of people. I've written books about Restoration Movement. I've written books about Oral Roberts and Pat Robertson, and a very early book that had to do with this book here called All Things Are Possible, which is a book about Pentecostalism, and which was little understood. And so that book, which was called All Things Are Possible, got a rave review in New York Times by a Harvard professor. And it explored that whole source of people who lived in Pentecostal environments. They, by the way, All Things Are Possible is still in print, and it's sold over 100,000 copies. And it's partly because Pentecostals themselves were pleased just for someone to write a book that tried to treat them seriously. And of course it was a very raucous, growing movement. But they, by the way, I still get revenue from All Things Are Possible. They still buy it. I'll tell you one other quick shortcut. When my wife and I were in a hotel in India years ago, and I almost could get to where I could define if it was somebody from one of these groups. So I saw these two couples across the way while we were eating dinner, and I told my wife, I said, I bet those are Pentecostal missionaries. And so she said, well, how can you tell that? I said, well, I'm going to go over. So I walked over and I said, are you missionaries here? And they said, yes. And I said, what group? And they said, you wouldn't know. I said, I bet I know. And so they gave me a name and said, I forget exactly which group they were with, but they gave it to me. And I said, yes, I said, I know them well. He said, how did you know us? But it wasn't me that finally ended up. He said, are you David Harrell? I said, yes, I am. So he ran out, went up to his room, and got his book, and they gave took pictures of me, and so that was pretty big stuff to go to India to be recognized. But the reason it was recognized is because they were all over, which is why, by the way, I wrote that book, is because there was just a wave of religious expansion. And for the most part, the Methodists didn't know that. And consequently, the Pentecostals were all over the place. Well, I came to be quite well known by Pentecostals because I told them that I'd tell the truth. And if you tell people the truth, then the truth will finally come out. And so, okay, let me see here. How are we doing time-wise? I got
10, 15 minutes left.
all right, good. Now, I have in this an enormous number of copies of documents of people who have, through the centuries, given themselves to being faithful to the scriptures. And we don't have time to go through this. I sometimes do pictures in our congregation about how many people all through the years, I'm convinced that all through religious history, there have been people who said what we need to do is simply commit ourselves to follow the scriptures, follow the teachings of the New Testament. I wish I had time to go through this, but I'm convinced that there is a line that's quite visible from the time of the earliest Christians to the present day, that there are lines of people that have said that what we need to do is to simply follow the teachings that we read about in the New Testament. And really all the historian does is tell the truth. Read the stories and tell the truth. There's, as I said, I wish I had time to go through this long list of people who, through the studies of the New Testament, have said what we need to do is just follow what the New Testament says. I can't resist telling you just a little bit about Michael Faraday. Some of you are probably familiar with Michael Faraday. He's one of the great figures in the, well, he was born in 1792, died 1870 something, 1867. Faraday was one of that great group of English scholars who really just changed the atmosphere of modern history. But he himself came from a poor family. His father was just a day worker. And he himself was totally uneducated. He never went to a school or a university. But he was a pioneer of a half a dozen different streams of thought that are important even to today. He was a lifetime member of and was an elder in the Church of Christ in London, which was called the Church of Christ. And they would have looked perfectly like what you call the Church of Christ today. And that was based on his conviction that he needed to just follow the scriptures. He, by the way, before he was about 30 years old, he became, his discoveries had been so enormous that he was honored with a doctorate from the Oxford University Society. And received so many awards. He was honored in lots of ways. Among the ways that are interesting is he was offered burial in Westminster Abbey, which is the great funeral place. At his time, there were 3 funeral homes in England. There was a Catholic, a Protestant, and everybody else. And people were buried in one of those things. He was offered burial in Westminster Abbey alongside Isaac Newton, who's maybe the most famous of all British experts. So he was a total nonconformist. He refused and insisted that he be buried in the nonconformist That's, by the way, if you ever go to London, his statue is on Savoy Place. Here, by the way, here's the statement of that was made by one of the elders in the church, and of which he was a part. Someone asked, by the way, my favorite place to go is in London, and I just sit in the British Library all day. And I ran up on this letter that had been written by one of the members of that congregation. And this is what it reads. We think ourselves bound to regard the word of Christ and his apostles in the plain, obvious, and original meaning, looking upon every precept in the New Testament, except such as may relate to miracle. We think ourselves bound to follow the practice of the primitive disciples and churches as far as we can learn from the New Testament, how they walked while the apostles were with them, bellowing their order, behaving their order, and steadfastness. Well, okay. The point of this is, he said, what we do is we just intend to follow the Scripture. And the only thing that we are committed to is to find out what the Scriptures say and to do that and nothing more. Amen. That's where I was. And that's where I am. And that's where the hundreds and thousands of people that go from the apostolic period to the present day can make that same assertion. And we can write the things that we want to write. By the way, did I tell you, Faraday refused to be buried in Westminster Abbey, where it'd be if you've ever been there, it's easy to find people because you just walk all over them. But he refused to do that. He said he wanted to be buried with the other people, the common people. Now, if I want to stop this and go on, I mean, this is immensely interesting to me. But you can find then a line before this and after this that says that you just need one thing, and that is to go follow the Scriptures. And this is the Salem Covenant, which was written in 1629 among the Puritans, who were, by the way, just the predescendants of the Restoration Movement. We covenant with the Lord and with one another by ourselves in the presence of God to walk together in all his words according as he pleads. And I don't know, I have a whole slide of these people who have said through the years that what we do is we just read the New Testament and follow it, and that's all. Now, how much time I got left?
About 5 minutes.
5 minutes. I need to stop. But I've got some great Alexander Campbell stories for you. But let's see. What?
Going back.
Going backwards, aren't I? Yeah, I'm going backwards. I tell you well, I just about used all our time anyhow, but I'll tell you an interesting Alexander Campbell story. Alexander Campbell was, he was one of the early pioneers, of course, in saying that we needed to just go back and follow the scriptures. He, very early in his life, agreed to run for the, and become, he was delegated as one of the delegates for the changing of the British, of the Virginia. And among the people who were there is when he went to this honored place, he was one of the delegates, but there were 3 presidents that were there. And one of them, forget which one it was.
There you go, right there.
Hey, you got it. Yeah, it was Madison. Madison said that, by the way, he was preaching on Sundays while this group was meeting. And he wrote his wife and said that he was preaching to about 3,000 people a day on Sundays. And I preached yesterday to about 3,000 souls. President Madison said that he was the greatest preacher that he ever heard. So, he was a pretty good preacher. All right, I'm gonna leave the rest of this. Now, that's my, that's where it gets me to the end of this, and that is that I was in, just for your information, a couple of conferences that took place. If you're interested in some information Richard Hughes, who many of you probably know, was an expert fundraiser, and so he raised two funds in which all of the largest, best historians in the country, religious historians, participated. One of them was called The Primitive Church in Modern Era. I observed as the I surrendered. I did the ending of both of these groups. This one was said that there was somebody from every one more minute.
Go ahead.
That there were somebody from every major denomination had made a speech, and then I supposedly corrected them all. and I mean, what most of them said was, you know, the Methodist or whatever, that we were pretty poor at the beginning, but we're better now and we're getting along. What occurred to me is they were getting worse all the time. But I deferred on that and said, okay, that still is the best and most important idea in American religious history. And that is that all churches ought to go back and be respectable and responsible to. Now this second thing in which Richard somehow got the money, he invited all of us once again to come back, and every major religious historian in the country was present in these. And so they said after this 3-year gap that, well, we've learned better now. And I know a lot of those people used to believe those basic units, but now we know that we don't behave like that anymore. We think up new games. So anyhow, Richard asked me to critique the whole end of this, and he said, don't keep any notes or anything. Just get up and say what you think at the end. So if you ever have a chance, that's the best thing I ever wrote. And it is just that, okay, you guys are all over the place now, teaching all kind of things. And all I can say is that what we need to do is go back and read the scriptures and do what, because that's the only thing that gives a solid base to religious historians, is to say that this is what the scriptures teach us that we should do. So I'm not going to read you this because it takes just a minute, but it's good. Thanks a lot, you guys.